Welcome to episode 213 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Tom O'Connor, who served in the FBI for 22 years. Assigned to the Washington Field Office, WFO, on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, he worked both international and domestic terrorism cases during his bureau career. In this episode, Tom O'Connor reviews investigations involving criminal activity and violence conducted by racially motivated and anti-government violent extremists, to include neo-Nazi and other hate-based groups, as well as lone actors. Tom served as WFO's program coordinator for these matters. Tom was the case agent for both the Pentagon lone offender shooting and the Family Research Council lone offender shooting. He was also a team leader on the Evidence Response Team, ERT. In this capacity, he has led forensic teams to multiple terrorist attacks around the globe. He also processed evidence at both the Pittsburgh Tree of Life synagogue shooting and the Virginia Beach government building shooting. He specialized in post-blast investigations and shooting reconstruction evidence recovery. Tom has provided instruction on domestic and international terrorism issues across the United States and overseas. As an FBI Master Police Instructor and a certified Adjunct Faculty member for the FBI Academy, the Department of Justice awarded him their Instructor of the Year award in 2004. Currently, Tom is a principal consultant for F Squared Consulting. He can be reached by email at tfoconnor83@gmail.com or on LinkedIn. This is an extremely timely FBI Retired Case File Review episode. The threats to the United States and democracy are real. During our conversation, Tom said, white supremacist violence is the number one threat to the United States. I want to say so much more in this introduction. But just last week, I received an email from a listener who thanked me for my show and said it was his safe place. I get that. So I'm going to do what I've always promised you when it comes to the FBI. I'm going to let this case review speak for me. However, I want to clearly state that I denounce white supremacist groups and all violent extremist organizations. There's so much hostility and nastiness in our world today. I definitely want this to be your safe place. Coincidentally, in my October Reader Team email, I attempt to review the Showtime miniseries, The Comey Rule, for FBI cliches and misconceptions without being partisan. Let's just say I tried my best and used the excellent book October Surprise by Washington Post journalist Devlin Barrett to guide me. If you don't see my Reader Team email in your inbox by Friday morning, October 2nd, you know what to do. Check your spam filter. Of course, I want to welcome new listeners and invite you to join my Reader Team. This podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my monthly email, I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. When you join my Reader Team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoir. You can join my Reader Team on my website or use the link in your podcast app's description of this episode. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Tom O'Connor. Hi, Tom. How are you?
How you doing, Jerry? It's great to be back with you.
Yeah, the last time that you were on, you hadn't retired yet. You were on in your role as the president of the Agents Association, and we spoke about line of duty deaths and illnesses due to 9/11 crime scenes. But you are now retired.
I am. Gene and I both retired on September 11th of 2019, and we chose September 11th as a way to honor the fallen from the day of 9/11 and also the 16 FBI agents and FBI employees who have died since 9/11 by exposure, cancers, and other illnesses that they received from exposure at all three of the sites at New York, Pentagon, and Shanksville.
Well, you were definitely the subject matter expert for that as part of your role as the president of the Agents Association. But your career as a special agent in the FBI, as an investigator, you spent your time working on a domestic terrorism task force, and that's what we're here today to talk about domestic terrorism.
Yes, my main investigative efforts were done in the area of domestic terrorism with a specialty in white supremacist extremists. And, people would say to me, oh, come on, you gotta do something different. You gotta do something different. And I really enjoyed working that stuff. And you really felt you were making a difference by working these cases. I stayed on the Joint Terrorism Task Force for 23 years. 9/11, everybody says that it changed their lives. And in one way that it changed Gene and mine careers and lives was that we never put in for one promotion. We stayed on the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Gene ran the evidence team out of Washington field office, and we wanted to stay there doing these jobs in case something else happened. As our careers progressed, there were things happening constantly, whether it be overseas or with domestic shootings and different events we were able to be involved in and really feel like your involvement in your work is very meaningful. So, 23 years on the JTTF, I actually think that might be a record for the Bureau. I've asked that question and no one's been able to come up with somebody that spent longer on one squad, on one task force, and one field office. So I'm a first office agent at Washington field office.
Well, I think it's important to let people who are not in the FBI know that for the majority of the agents in the FBI, most decide to remain investigators and not put in for promotions and, not go up the ladder, not because leadership is not an important part of the FBI, but there's leadership also at that level as an investigator. And you can certainly say that you were a leader in that respect also.
I hope so. I know that as your time on the job goes, you gain experience. And that experience as a senior agent, working with newer agents and kind of helping them through the minefields of an investigation is rewarding. And I think it's something that is very important to have that senior leadership from the squad level, people that they can go talk to and not feel like they're, having to go to the boss on everything. They can come to you and talk to you and you can kind of help guide them. I enjoyed doing that quite a bit. I arrived in 1997 to the Washington field office Joint Terrorism Task Force, and we worked both international and domestic terrorism. After 9/11, there was a reorganization of the counterterrorism division, and I decided I was going to stay with domestic terrorism because I found it very interesting. And I also saw a lot of talent going over to the international side of the house, and I thought it was important to keep your eye on the ball on the domestic extremists that we knew were still in the United States. Just because of 9/11 didn't mean they went away. Actually, just the opposite, I think. So I wanted to stay involved with that. And I did so for 23 years, working with domestic extremists. And through the evidence response team, was able to stay pretty much involved in the international side of the house also.
We'll talk about this more at the very end of the episode. But you're really continuing to take advantage of your knowledge base in domestic terrorism. You and Gene have a new consulting firm, Fed Square Consulting.
That's right. It is two feds putting our minds together. And right now, domestic terrorism has really become an issue that people are talking about. And so I'm using the platform of Fed Square Consulting, my 23 years working domestic extremism, to kind of get some facts out there. Right now, the United States is more polarized than I've seen it in my lifetime. There is more people going to the corners, right? And so less people in the middle that are kind of taking everything in and making their own decisions. People are kind of going to one side or the other. And when that happens, you have an extreme of that element, which potentially could become extremists in the point of violent actions. So I think it's very important that people learn about domestic terrorism, know what the threat is, and that the old adage that knowledge is power is something that I think is important, because people know about international terrorism, but they haven't really been talking about domestic terrorism up until the last couple of years.
I have done a number of episodes about domestic terrorism, case reviews, and so I think in my mind and in many listeners' minds, when they think about domestic terrorism, they think about the Unabomber and Oklahoma City bombing. But I was doing my research. You sent me some links to look at, and I looked at some on my own, and wow, it is frightening. And you're right, it's very important for us to be more aware. And so instead of just doing a case review, I'm calling this a program review. So we're going to really get into what is domestic terrorism. And you promised me that you would also at the same time share some case reviews, some things that you've been involved in that can really give us a deep look at what exactly all of this means when it's played out in real life. So first question, what's domestic terrorism?
So domestic terrorism is defined under the United States Federal Code, Title 18, U.S. Code 2331, and that is the law which gives a definition to domestic terrorism. And that's important, the definition of domestic terrorism. There's three parts to this definition. The first one is that it has to be an act that's dangerous to human life and is a violation of criminal laws of the United States or any state. And that's important. It doesn't have to be just a federal violation. It can be a violation of a state law, so a homicide or something along those lines. And it has to be a serious violent action that violates criminal law. So that shows that it has to be a crime, okay? So that's the easy part. And when you see things happening on TV and you say, well, why aren't they calling that terrorism, or why are they calling that terrorism? If you break this down, it becomes a little bit clearer. And then I'm going to throw mud all over it in a few minutes to kind of make it a little less clear. So we see that it's a serious criminal violation. But the second part of that is that it needs to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. So using that violent criminal action to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or the policy of a government. And that's the most important part. When you see a shooting or an event that takes place where somebody does an action and people are injured and you say, wow, is that terrorism or is it not terrorism? You have to look at that second part there to see if it's terrorism. It has to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or to influence the policy of a government. Now, the third part in domestic terrorism is that act and the planning of that act, that it occurs primarily in the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, which means that it is built here and taken place by U.S. citizens. So that's what makes domestic terrorism domestic versus the international side of the house. Now, with the internet changes the way they are today and communication platforms, all sorts of different things that we'll talk about as we get into this, there's a lot more influence from outside of the United States. And the United States has influence on other parts of the world when it comes to terrorism. And so nothing is as clear as it was maybe in the early 90s. And we'll kind of talk about that in just a minute.
When you said that domestic terrorism is maybe worse today based on what's going on internationally, I mean, that really hit home.
I mean, nothing appears as what it is, right? So there is, for it to be domestic terrorism, it has to primarily be within the jurisdiction of the United States, but there can be influence. And recently, the State Department has, as I talked about the foreign terrorist organizations, the FTOs, there's a special designation that goes along with some groups so that they can be targeted financially. But for the first time, a group called the Russian Imperial Movement was placed on that special designation through the State Department, which doesn't give it a full foreign terrorist organization, but it shows that there's links between people in the United States and an organization, the Russian Imperial Movement, that has domestic ideologies, and that there is some link there. So that literally just happened earlier this spring for the first time ever in the United States. Now, when we're talking about domestic terrorism and working domestic terrorism cases, there's one thing that is, I always call it the golden rule. It's the most important thing for an investigator when working these investigations. That is the First Amendment. Investigations cannot be opened up solely based on what is First Amendment protected activity. So when you hear about, right now, there are protests going on all around the country. If somebody calls the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force and says, Group A is planning a rally and they're going to block streets, that's not something that the FBI can open up a case on, because it is First Amendment protected activity to protest, and that if they're blocking streets, that's a civil disobedience, and it's covered by the state and locals. It's not that does not rise to the level of domestic terrorism in any way, shape, or form. Not only does it have to not be based on just a First Amendment activity, but that there has to be a valid law enforcement purpose for the FBI to become involved in that investigation. And the FBI has to really practice extreme caution in opening these cases, because you don't want to potentially chill someone's First Amendment rights to protest. So what that means is if I feel strongly about event A and I'm going to go stand in front of City Hall with my sign and say, I think this should be done, or I think that should be done. If I think that law enforcement, or the FBI specifically, is going to be there watching me and taking names, then I may not go there, right? So the FBI has to be extremely careful not to chill a person's First Amendment rights to protest, to free speech. And that plays into many of the domestic extremists and domestic terrorism squad operations. Because when you look at terrorist organizations that are on that list by the State Department, the Foreign Terrorist Organizations list, Al-Qaeda, it's an illegal organization. It's illegal to support them. Now, if you look at a group, let's just say the Ku Klux Klan. Ku Klux Klan is a group which I hope people don't support, but we know that there are many that do, or other organizations similar to it. That is a First Amendment right to be a member of, to espouse their belief systems, as long as you don't commit a criminal act to forward that movement or that ideology. That's First Amendment protected. And it's the same on the right as it is on the left. These organizations are not terrorist organizations. So recently you heard, we all know the Ku Klux Klan, you can be a member. Antifa, an organization, or actually it's not an organization, but a movement that has been said should be called a terrorist organization. It doesn't have membership, it doesn't have leadership, but most importantly, it's First Amendment protected, just like being a member of the Aryan Nations or the Ku Klux Klan is. So we can't call it a terrorist group. It's just not how, in the United States, these things are done under the Constitution. It is First Amendment protected activity. If you look through the history of extremism in the United States, we'll talk a little bit about the patriot movement, militias, that type of thing. When people think about domestic extremism, that's probably one of the first things that comes to light. And in the 1990s, and you have to draw some analogies here, or some connections, right, as I'm going through this. In the 1990s, the patriot movement, the militia movement started rising, started getting more membership. And that was taking place because of things like Waco, Ruby Ridge, things that the people who believed in those movements felt the U.S. government, the federal government, was overstepping their bounds. And so they started anti-government movements in the 90s that moved forward. Then you had Timothy McVeigh. You mentioned the Murrah Federal Building bombing. That took place. And the purpose that McVeigh did that was to build a racial holy war, to bring together those like-minded groups, whether they be white supremacist groups, white nationalist groups, anti-government groups. And it kind of did, with some people it did that, but with many it kind of pushed them away, because they saw the tremendous loss of life that took place during that bombing. 168 people were killed, many of them children, and that pushed some people away. But still, in the 90s, you started to see the rise in this patriot movement, the militia movements going forward. The FBI classifies domestic extremism in 4 categories: racially motivated violent extremism, anti-government, anti-authority motivated violent extremists, animal rights and abortion rights motivated violent extremists. Now, interestingly, you can have left and right involved in the first two, racially motivated violent extremists and anti-government. Doesn't say you have to be the Klan or Antifa or whoever it is. It is anti-government, anti-authority, and if those violent actions meet the definition that we spoke about earlier, then it can be an act of domestic terrorism individually. And we'll talk about that in just a second as we go forward here. In the 90s, you also saw some serious real groups, organizations that came together, and one of them being the Aryan nations. And Richard Butler was the leader, charismatic leader of the Aryan nations, and he built on the economic downturns of the 1990s. He built on the perception that the Second Amendment was being taken apart and people's rights to own firearms were being taken away from them during the Clinton administration. That was the feeling that there were going to be restrictions on firearms. And so people started going over to different groups to try and protect that and their ideological movements. In the Aryan nations itself, it was a Christian identity-based, very strong anti-government. Then, as we mentioned, the Ku Klux Klan, that was something that had grown over the years. In the 30s, it was numbered in the tens, almost hundreds of thousands of people that were involved in that. In the 60s, during the civil rights era, as a counter to the civil rights, the Ku Klux Klan again came back with numbers, and the FBI was extremely effective at infiltrating and breaking up the Ku Klux Klan. There still is Klan today, but it is not anything that it was in the 30s and the 60s. And it actually, the Ku Klux Klan has been around since just following the Civil War, started by a person named Nathan Bedford Forrest in Pulaski, Tennessee. And it started out as more of a social group and quickly turned to a terror organization that were chasing down freed slaves and those who supported them and that type of thing. So now it's one of the most old school, the National Alliance. And this we'll also see comes up in current day groups that are out there that are operating. In the 1990s, again, William Pierce, building on the downturn of the economy in the United States. Pierce was linked with George Lincoln Rockwell, who started the American Nazi Party in the 1960s. Rockwell was assassinated in late 1960s, 1967 to be exact, in Arlington, Virginia. Pierce went on to start the National Alliance after they split, and he wrote what's called the Turner Diary. And the Turner Diary was a book that kind of was the blueprint for Timothy McVeigh. It was the bombing of a federal building. It was the start of the racial holy war. It was a collapse of society. And
And this was fiction, right?
This is fiction, right? But it became a blueprint. And Timothy McVeigh in his car actually had pages of the Turner Diary with him that he used to inspire him for going forward in his domestic terrorism movement. In the late 1990s, 2000s, the National Alliance was leading marches in the United States. They're bringing a lot of people out. And when that was happening, we had marches in Washington, D.C. that I was involved in working with local law enforcement. And there may have been 400 or 500 neo-Nazis that would show up from all different organizations. But the counter to that was, people who didn't want Nazis marching through Washington, D.C., Holocaust survivors. But then within that, the opposition to the Nazis was a small group of anarchists, and Black Bloc is what they called themselves then. And they were just there to cause problems, to try and break up the neo-Nazi march. So they were what they called themselves anti-fascists. So if we look at today, we're hearing during the protests and then what has happened at many locations, the riots, the looting, the violence is being perpetrated by a movement called Antifa, anti-fascist. So these people have been around for a long time. Their initial purpose was to counter the fascist neo-Nazi marches which took place across the country in the late 90s, and then the World Bank, that type of thing. But in the late 90s, the National Alliance was actually bringing in over $1 million a year in books on their Vanguard website, and they were white supremacists, white nationalists, books and music. There's a whole white power music industry that was something that really supported the movement of the National Alliance and other organizations that were umbrellaed under that.
And of course, I believe in the First Amendment and protected speech, but I have to tell you, just listening to you talk about these groups, these racially motivated extremist groups, white supremacy and hate, I don't want them in this country. Even as a retired law enforcement person, it's hard to understand, but I can accept because I believe in the Constitution. But I'm telling you, it's hard.
It's difficult. And so the way, and I've had this conversation for literally now decades with people, and it comes down to, you and I agree that the neo-Nazis, the fascists, the different organizations that I just spoke about are something that we don't agree with. We're clearly not going to go sign up to go march with them. We're not going to support them. But it comes down to where you draw that line. Okay, so when you get to the abortion violence, so violence committed against abortion centers, doctors, this type of thing, people may go march in pro-life or pro-choice. Those two things are very, very integral in the United States politics, right? So you can't call the pro-choice or pro-life, either side of that, a terrorist organization. So, because they're not, right? They're extremists within either side that may break out into violence, and those individuals may be guilty of an act which rises to the occasion and meets the definition that we spoke about earlier. So whenever we're looking at this stuff, you have to really think back to that definition. And does it meet the specifics of that definition by that individual act? But domestically, all of these groups, all of these movements, ideologies are protected by the First Amendment. And the fact that you and I don't like that group and that it has a right to do what it does makes us what we are today. Because what you and I may not agree on, or that it is wrong, or we don't like this group, somebody else does. And First Amendment, that's why we have it. You have a right to speak, and people don't have to agree with you. You don't have to support it. But I get where you're coming from on both of these sides. There are people saying that, the protests in Portland and all across the country, that should be banned. Okay, so that's a slippery slope, right? We have to be very careful. What should be illegal and is illegal is the burning of police cars, the smashing of windows. But does it rise to the occasion, and does it fulfill the definition of domestic terrorism? That is things that has to be looked at on an individual basis, right? So each one of those events, those actions, those crimes has to be looked at to see if it fits that definition. And if it does, it should be charged. And we'll get into the charging of domestic terrorism in just a minute. So we talked a little bit about Antifa and where it comes from, and that this is not something new. This has been going on in the United States for a number of years. It has historically been a local and state police action where people are arrested for violence, for looting, and that type of thing. So where does this anarchist movement come from? And I call it a movement because it doesn't really have a structure like the two or three groups that I just mentioned, where you had Richard Butler and William Pierce as leaders with a structure in an organization. Anarchist is more of a socialist, communist ideology. They believe in a communal, cooperative lifestyle. Importantly, anti-globalization, anti-government, and anti-police. What they strongly believe in is the breakdown in our civil society, and then have a anarchist or communist socialist uprising to run the United States. Same thing as those right-wing organizations would like to see the fall of our government and have their belief system in place. So they're diametrically opposed to each other, but if you took them and took away the pictures and just put the descriptions, you would see that they fall under that anti-government, anti-authority motivated ideologies. And the people who act out in violence potentially could be domestic terrorists or persons that meet the definition of domestic terrorism.
For all of those groups, in order to reach their goal, it seems like violence has to be a part of it, because no one else, all those people, you and I and everybody else in the middle, we're not going to accept what their goals are. Division and anti-government, we're not going to accept it. And so if they want to be successful in reaching their goals, it seems like at the core has to be this violent extremism, violent ideology.
Yeah, you're 100% right. So there is actually a thought process out there now. It's called accelerationism. And accelerationism can be used on both sides of this coin. And what they believe is that the downfall of society needs to be accelerated at any cost. And as I talked about in the 1990s, the economy was faltering. The belief was that the Second Amendment was being stepped on, overreaching federal government. And that brought a rise to the domestic extremism in the United States. Right now, if you look at that, you have an economy, an unemployment rate, you have a pandemic, you have a country that is polarized left and right, more so than it has ever been in my 57 years. Right now, this is the time for this type of groups on both sides to rise, to try and bring on the right the racial holy war, the RAHOA, and on the left, the fall of society, so it can be replaced by the socialist anarchist belief system.
So they're both trying to exploit the instability of our lives right now.
100%. We also have to think about, if a foreign actor was to look at the United States in the polarization, would they want to influence both sides of this coin to get that other side more angry at the other side? And the answer would have to be yes, right? So if we think back when the fall of the wall, do you remember President Reagan saying, Mr. Gorbachev,
take down that wall?
Right? So that was something that was done internally by the people within the Soviet Union, and they demanded it. And right now, the people in the United States are in a place where they're susceptible to influences from outside. If there is reporting on Twitter and all these different social media platforms that people now are getting their news from, you have to be very, very careful what you're reading is legitimate, and reposting. And that is not helping us in this event, right? And this time we're going through.
Let me ask you a question, though, because, and please, everyone listening, I do not support any type of group that is looking to overthrow the government. So let's be clear on that. But it does seem that when we talk about being on both sides, that it's extremely lopsided. You have Antifa, which you said was loosely, it's not even an organization. There's no leader on one side, and then on this other side, and we'll be talking about the groups that are active right now that have organizations, that have leaders, that seem to be organized. It seems to me that it's really lopsided. If there was some type of civil war.
You talk about it's lopsided. The DHS and the FBI have reported over the past several years that right-wing extremism, specifically white supremacist violence, is the number one threat to the United States with domestic terrorism. The examples of groups actually committing acts of terrorism, whether it be groups like in the old days, there were the Order, which was a white power group run by a guy named Robert Matthews. And they actually killed a Jewish talk show host as an organization. They robbed banks. They did all sorts of really bad stuff as the group in an order to move forward their ideological movement.
Yeah, I did do a case review on the Order, so I know about that group.
It's a great example of that. And on the ideological opposite side, you had the Weathermen, which turned into the Weather Underground, and they committed bombings. They actually bombed the U.S. Capitol. They bombed a police station in New York. groups were responsible for terrorist actions, right? But the vast majority of domestic terrorism events are going to be lone offender, homegrown violent extremists.
Like Timothy McVeigh and the Unabomber. What was his real name?
Ted Kaczynski.
Ted Kaczynski. That's what they were all about.
Exactly. These are people who may have followed organizations like the Aryan Nations or the National Alliance or the anarchist movement on the Ted Kaczynski side, but they weren't doing it to forward a specific group. They were doing it to forward their ideological belief, which fell under one of those umbrellas. So what I want to do now is kind of talk about a few of the cases that I worked on in the Washington field office and kind of go through them, you know, to see how they meet the definition of domestic terrorism. And we'll let your audience kind of be the judge to see if it does meet that. But also want to mention that there is as I mentioned, the definition of domestic terrorism. I went over that when we first started talking.
Now, why don't you refresh everybody's memory? Because if you're going to give them a quiz, I want to make sure that they have the test material.
So basically 3 points, right? So first, it has to be an act of violence and is a violation of criminal laws of the United States or any state. Secondly, that has to be done to intimidate the population or to influence the policy of a government. So you have to be trying to change something by doing this act. Now, the act may be an individual shooting or a murder, but you have to look at the big picture. Why did this person do this? And these people, in many cases, are hoping that their act will further throw the country into the racial holy war to separate this. The anarchists in that side, that movement, they're trying to destabilize the capitalist United States, bring it down to its knees, and have it be replaced by a communist, socialist, communal type of a civilization. So both have their end goals, and that one specific act in the lone offender mindset is to trigger that to happening. Okay, does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, it is terrorism no matter what you call it, right? As we're talking about that definition and the cases we're going to talk about, I'll give you the background on the case, and you can say, yeah, that meets the definition of domestic terrorism because the person was trying to influence the policies of a government or a civilian population by doing this criminal act. Now, if you find that the person did that, here's where the really strange part of this is. In virtually almost all cases, unless you use a bomb, a certain type of a weapon of mass destruction to commit your violent act, if it's a shooting, a car ramming, a stabbing, under 2331, there is no penalty for committing these acts. So when you have a crime that takes place that somebody's trying to influence a civilian population, intimidate that population, and influence the government, and you can see that, and we'll go through these case studies in just a minute, if you find that to be meeting the definition, there is still no currently penalty under Section 2331. So that person is charged with carrying a gun across state lines, homicide, attempted homicide, any number of state cases or federal charges, but they're never going to be charged under those circumstances without the WMD as a domestic terrorist, which when we finish this, I want to go through why that's a problem, okay? So the first case I want to talk about is in 2009, James Von Brunn, a known white supremacist extremist, what is called now a racially motivated violent extremist, pulled up out in front of the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. He was 88 years old, okay? So he was, in the white power world, the number 88, the eighth letter of the alphabet is H. So very important, their mindset is those two letters, HH, or the numbers 88. They stand for Heil Hitler. So in his 88th year, Von Brunn pulls up in front of the Holocaust Museum, a museum dedicated to the Jewish Holocaust during World War II. And he walks up to the door carrying a .22 caliber long rifle. And Officer Johns does exactly what any law enforcement security officer you would hope would do. When they see an older man walking up to the door, he opens the door for him. Von Brunn lifts his rifle and fires one round, hitting Officer Johns in the chest. And then officers from inside the building return fire, striking Von Brunn. He goes down to the ground. He survives for several months, but then dies while in federal custody from his wounds. So if we look at that definition of domestic terrorism, it's a violent action, criminal act, and it was intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population and potentially influence the policies of a government. And it was happened here in the United States. The person was a United States citizen, and the plot was thought out here. It was a lone offender plot. Von Brunn was actually a decorated U.S. Navy veteran from World War II. He was charged with murder on state charges and some federal charges related to coming across a state line with a firearm. He did not live to go to trial, so he was never charged with, never went to court on those charges, but he was never charged as a domestic terrorist.
So was there something that he left behind that at least indicated what his goal and purpose was in going to the Holocaust Museum?
100% there was. His writings, he had actually written actual books on white supremacy and how the white man actually was responsible for all good things that have taken place in the world pretty much. And very, very anti-Jew, anti-Semitic belief systems, postings, writings. Now, this happened in 2009 prior to a lot of the social media platforms that we're seeing today. So all of his stuff was handwritten, actual author of books, but his mindset was clearly anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, and anti-government. So he would fall under the racially motivated violent extremists. He met those 3 bullet points for the 2331 definition of domestic terrorism, but he could not be charged with domestic terrorism if he had survived, because there is no penalty for committing acts like that. The next one I want to talk about is in 2010. So the next year at the U.S. Pentagon, John Patrick Bedell, who was a very strong anti-war, anti-government, didn't believe that we should be involved in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He traveled from California to the Washington, D.C. area. He parked his car outside the Pentagon, the mall, went to the food court, and when he was there, he had on his person 2 handguns, which he bought illegally on his way across the country, and 300 rounds of ammunition on his person. So loaded to go do some really bad stuff. Important thing on this, if you were going to do a shooting just because you wanted to kill people, do you think that the mall at Pentagon City would be an easier target, and the ability at the food court to create mass damage to people, or the heavily guarded U.S. Pentagon? He chose the U.S. Pentagon. He went to the Pentagon. He approached one of the gates by the wooden doors and immediately started firing officers. Officers responded exceptionally well. They fired back at him. 2 officers were struck during the firefight, and Bedell was struck twice and died on scene. So if you look at the definition, here's a person who attacked a federal facility, and his purpose was anti-government, anti-war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then you also throw in there some unfortunate mental illness, and you have the makeup for a bad event, right? This case, if Bedell had lived, you're seeing a trend. There are many times the shooter in these cases is taken out by law enforcement during the commission of their attack and never stand trial to begin with. So it becomes not an issue on the ability to charge or not charge.
Is that part of their mission, to be a martyr?
No, I don't believe so in this case, because the writings he had was to continue on. So he didn't show up there as the idea of I'm not going to leave here. That just is what happened. Neither one of the cases was it like a suicide run type of event. And then as we go to 2011, and this is one that really was an extremely interesting case, and the subject lived in this event. So in 2011, there's a location called the Family Research Council Research Center in Washington, D.C. And the Family Research Council is a think tank, a conservative think tank. And a guy named Floyd Lee Corkins went there a few days ahead of time and he actually buzzed the buzzer to get into the security, and they allowed him in. He said he had a meeting with somebody there for an internship, and they said, we don't have that person working here. He said, I must be in the wrong place. So this was a dry run where he figured he could get into the location. He purchased a handgun and had 2 magazines of ammunition with him. Interestingly, he bought a 22 caliber semi-automatic pistol and a conversion kit to make it a 9mm, and in his words, to cause more damage. This was a really interesting case, as Jean, my wife, was she was a coordinator for the evidence team. So I was the case agent for the investigation, and the evidence and the case were intertwined very much so, in that the evidence coming off there really kind of gave us an idea what was going on. What this shooter did was he went there a few days after he did the dry run, and he got back in again. And as soon as he got inside, he said, that once again was questioned by a different security officer, unarmed security officer, and they questioned him as to the name of the person. And he said, well, let me check my bag. He went down into his bag below the desk area and pulled out that 9mm and fired point blank at the security officer's body. He missed. The security officer went on the charge. They fought over the gun. Corkins was able to get off 2 more rounds, and one of them struck the security officer in the arm. Security officer amazingly got the gun away from Corkins, and this is where it becomes important into a statement. Corkins then said to him, quote, don't shoot me, it's not about you, it's this place and their policies, end quote. So he didn't shoot the security guard because he didn't like him. He shot him because he was the first person in the way to getting into killing more people. The reason he did this was Corkins was a gay rights activist. This is in his own words during an interview. Gay rights activist. Instead of standing outside this place that did not support gay marriage and holding a sign saying, I don't support you, which is protected under the First Amendment and is considered protest, he went to the point of buying a gun, plotting and planning, and going to this location because the Family Research Council did not support gay marriage. To use force or violence as a way to influence the policies of this organization and to influence the policies of a government, right? In his interview, he said that his purpose was to go in there, kill as many people as he could, and smear Chick-fil-A sandwiches on their face. Interestingly, during the collection of evidence, Jean called me and she said, hey, we just found 15 Chick-fil-A sandwiches in this guy's backpack. And so we couldn't figure out what the heck was that about. Then it came to light that Chick-fil-A had come out against gay marriage. Chick-fil-A was supported by the Family Research Council. So he did this to try and get his ideology pushed forward. So that meets the definition of domestic terrorism. But when I went back to the U.S. Attorney's Office on this, and because we had a living subject to charge, I said, this is clearly domestic terrorism. And they said, oh, no, they looked it up and they were great guys, a guy and a gal. And they're phenomenal attorneys, and they were doing everything they could. They said, how about a hate crime? I said, it's not a hate crime. You had an African-American guy shoot an African-American guy. Where's the hate crime? It's not. He doesn't know the sexual followings of the person who was shot. That doesn't fit. So they said there's no penalty for doing what this guy did under domestic terrorism. And I didn't know it myself, right? And I've been working this stuff for years because we've been charging people with gun charges and this type of stuff. And it's very rare that it would come up to this point. So in the city of Washington, D.C., after 9/11, the district actually created a law of terrorism, and it fit the definition of this crime. So Corkins was the first person charged with domestic terrorism, but it was done so under a federal city's statute, not federal law.
What was the distinction in their legal definition of domestic terrorism, and what was missing from the federal look at it?
So it literally was almost the exact same definition, but they had a penalty applied to that definition. That if you commit a crime which fulfills this definition, you can be charged under this part of the statute. So currently, under federal law, unless a weapon of mass destruction is used, there is no way to charge. There's no charging document. There's no part of 2331 that says if you violate this definition, you can be charged under domestic terrorism. It's just not there. So,
all right, I'm a little confused because in every example being, I'm finding it hard to figure out federally when it would be appropriate.
The only time that it would be appropriate is when a weapon of mass destruction is used, so a bomb. And that came around after you mentioned Timothy McVeigh and the Murrah Federal Building. Prior to the bombing in the Murrah Federal Building, even with a weapon of mass destruction, it was not a penalty applied to it, right? So because 168 people were killed, not all of them were federal employees, which the federal government could charge for the death of the federal employees. They created the penalty using the weapon of mass destruction, so a bomb. Because that's the way terrorism was done back in the 90s. It was all bombs. People weren't shooting people. They weren't driving cars into people. And times have changed, so that statute needs to change with it. We need to change, and I have been an advocate for creating a penalty that goes along with the current definition of domestic terrorism. And that would be very, very easy to do. Except what's happening is that politicians on both the left and the right don't want to disturb their middle of the road base who may say, well, I support these guys or I support those guys, and so you're going to lose votes. And that really is what it comes down to.
And that is ridiculous because they would support somebody who would commit violence in order to put forth an ideology. Who would ever support that?
Well, I'll tell you. Let me just give you an example. I'm on social media. I'm pretty involved in the world of domestic terrorism and trying to get that information out. And when I post something about a white supremacist extremist who shoots up someplace or does something, and as I said before, the federal government, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security have shown that that is the more prominent violent threat. So when I post that, I'll clearly get people who write back to me, hey, you keep posting about these guys on the right. What about the guys on the left? And I'm like, well, if I was posting something about bank robbery, would you say, hey, you know what? You're not posting anything about check fraud. No, you wouldn't, right? Because they're both criminal actions. So, I mean, it's very interesting times. And that's all I can say is the partisanship, the divide within the United States has not made it easier to get legislation for a penalty for domestic terrorism when you would think with the threat of domestic terrorism on both sides of the coin being what it is today and what we're seeing in the news every single day, you would think it would go through like a knife through butter, but it doesn't because people are afraid to come out on either side of this because they don't want to affect their voting base in middle. And that's sadly the only reason I can see that it is being held up.
It does sound like even though they can't be charged federally, that at least none of these people are getting away with anything because they are being charged in 100%. State court.
100%. And that's an argument I've heard also. We don't need new laws to charge these people. And I'm full agreement that they are being charged, they're going to jail. But some of the importance of this is that you call a duck, right? And that when somebody is classified as a domestic terrorist, when they go into the federal prison system, there's different ways that the person are housed, where they're housed, that type of stuff. Also for, analysts that are looking through, how many acts of international terrorism have taken place in the United States. You can run that in Google and you're going to get a pretty accurate accounting of how many people were killed by international terrorism in the United States. But if you run domestic terrorism, you're not going to get anything close to accurate because the only way it's called terrorism is if somebody in the media decides it's terrorism. And it may not actually meet the definition, but it's what they want to call it terrorism that day. So there's no real specifics as to how we define it. So when you're doing research, you can't tell. When we're trying to find out what our threats are, you can't really tell because no one's ever charged with this stuff. So it's not as easy to do. And the most important thing, I think, is if you have a loved one who's killed in a violent action and you want to be able to say that this is an act of terrorism or how your loved one died, the fact that they died in an act of terrorism versus just a street crime may be very important to that family member. And I think that's what we're all here to do, is to take care of the families and make sure that they are supported. And by calling the act what it is, does that. So there's a lot of reasons why we should actually have laws on the books that penalize people for what they're doing. We as the FBI investigate bank robberies. We could easily go out and say, well, let's charge them with larceny. But we don't. We call them bank robbers because they robbed a bank.
And we also want to keep accurate statistics.
100%. I mean, you talk about your resources within law enforcement. How do you delegate your resources to something that doesn't exist? These are things that are outside of the, hey, we should do this. My bottom line is call it what it is. And that's important. That's one of the issues with domestic terrorism. We have a great definition, but it's very difficult to actually get a charging document on someone for anything outside of the use of a weapon of mass destruction. As we go forward, we can talk about some of the more recent actions. These are incidents that I wanted to highlight to try and show the definition of domestic terrorism is met in many cases, but the charging is just not there. Not that the law enforcement, the FBI, doesn't want to charge people. They can't. They charge them with carrying a gun across state lines, threats to kill, attempted murder, that type of stuff. What's happening in the United States is states are starting to make state statutes on domestic terrorism. And they're not following the exact definition in a lot of cases. And they're calling, some acts that may not be terrorism. And there needs to be a penalty to violating that definition, which is already there.
Of course, one that's extremely fresh in my mind was the Charleston, South Carolina church shooting. I'm thinking he was charged with domestic terrorism, but
He was charged with hate crimes, and he was charged with homicide on a state level. And you're talking about Dylan Roof, who killed several people in a church. And that is an example of a white supremacist going to a black church to kill black people in an effort to accelerate the racial holy war. Now, is a potential there to charge him with hate crimes and domestic terrorism? 100%. But Dylan Roof was only charged with hate crimes, and I agree with the charges of hate crimes. I also think that Dylan Roof fit the definition of domestic terrorism, and I don't see any issue with there being a cross-charging if they apply. But Dylan Roof was also a domestic terrorism subject. He was trying to accelerate the racial holy war by attacking a black church. No question in my mind about that one. And you'll see the influence as we go forward here. I'm going to explain the influence of something like a Dylan Roof shooting to shooters down the road. And the shooting at a mosque in Christchurch, where 53 people were killed, is used over and over in writings of extremists on the white supremacist side as this guy is a hero and that his actions should be taken in the United States. And so they build off, just like international terrorists do, and maybe even more so, they build off each other's actions to forward that person to do the next shooting. I think the intelligence gathering that we're doing in the United States has changed dramatically over the years, right? So still the most important aspect of building cases and preventing things is interaction with the community, involvement with the community, humans talking about what they're seeing and reporting things to their local police that they think might be potentially violent actions. And then as you get further and you get further into it, electronic, digital intelligence, and then the social media platforms. I recently did a presentation where I looked at an old slide of mine, and it had on it from 2010 the different ways of communication of extremists. And it went from mailing lists to emails and fax. So that was a big thing. Telephones to cell phones, meetings to chat rooms and gun show meetings, literature to the ever-present internet. Now, this is only 2010, the change in the internet, the social media, the communications. So here's a perfect example. In 1999, if you had a Ku Klux Klan cross light burning event, you may get 25, 50 people to it because it was all word of mouth. Let's fast forward to 2017. And at the University of Virginia, there was an unpermitted, unscheduled event that drew about 1,000 white nationalists. And they marched through the campus to an area where the Stonewall Jackson statue is. The statues had been a catalyst for a lot of these events. And if you were someone who believed in the history and don't tear it down because of the history and we need to do something differently, if you're marching with this group all carrying torches and people are chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and "Fire up the ovens, boys," you should really blow out your candle or your torch and go away, because this was nothing but hate. This had nothing to do with the statues. This was 1,000 white nationalists trying to instill fear on that campus. So how did that happen? It happened because social media, the ability to put out a tweet or a posting on Discord, Steam, 4chan, Telegram, any of those social media platforms now can draw thousands of people to an event. And we're seeing that across the United States for positive social protests and for the violence that goes along with the protests that are taking place across the country. It's all being sent out through social media, and people are able to respond to it for either legitimate First Amendment protests or the violence which has been hijacking those protests around the country. You know, in all reality, you haven't heard the name George Floyd in the news for quite some time now. All you're hearing about is the violence, the destruction, and that is what the anarchists, Antifa, want you to hear. And then you'll see also integrated into these First Amendment protected protests and hijacking them are people from the right to spin up the people on the left, and people from the left to spin up the people on the right. And you have to also understand that with social media and the internet and the ability for foreign actors to get onto Twitter, Facebook, Steam, Gab, all these things, the potential there to inflame and incite within the United States for their goals is clearly an opportunity that I personally do not believe that they're missing that opportunity.
No, I don't believe it either. The way that you're hearing about it and not hearing about the peaceful protests, which are continuing, is, you can tell immediately that you're being manipulated, that an agenda is being set forth that is not accurate to what's really occurring.
I'll tell you, I'm a 35-year law enforcement veteran, a career law enforcement officer, 15 years as a local officer and 23 years as an FBI agent. And after the incident and the killing of George Floyd, I think law enforcement leadership and the rank and file across the United States in mass were connected to, we can do better, we need to make change. And that, unfortunately, with the disruption, all of this other stuff that's come along with it, has taken that off the plate. And so we're no longer talking about making law enforcement the best that they possibly can be. We're talking about defunding, tearing down, and that is the extreme. And sadly, I honestly believe there was a great opportunity for law enforcement and the community to work together to make law enforcement, which is something that has to exist.
Yes.
As the very best. And always it should be a work in progress. And the far left and the far right hijack this to the point where they want to accelerate the downfall of society, and they don't really care about the reason. And that's a shame. As we go back to Charlottesville and how this whole thing happened, around 2016, there was a guy, Richard Spencer, he coined the term alt-right. And this is when the extreme right started to go away from the uniform Nazi Ku Klux Klan wearing. And it's done this over time with guys like David Duke through history, who ran for political office and became a professor. And William Pierce was a professor. And so there have been that leadership who's tried to keep away from the Nazi uniform wearing thugs to colleges and getting into the mind of those, in their teens and 20s to build a movement. And Richard Spencer did that through several different groups, the group Identity Europa, which changed its name to the American Identity Movement in 2019. But they were committed to going on campuses and speaking and talking to people about the fascist movement. And that's why you had 1,000 people show up, because Richard Spencer was there and others from his following that were there. And that clearly was shown through, you can look it up online and read some legitimate reporting that there were groups, Traditional Workers' Party, that had connections with the Russian imperial movement. And the word is that there was money that came back into the supporters and organizers of Charlottesville from organizations in Russia, persons in Russia, and that type of stuff. So there has been connections and that kind of thing along the way. So, when we talk about Charlottesville and we talk about, I just mentioned Richard Spencer and different people who were the organizers behind this stuff, this is all First Amendment protected. So they have the right to rally. They have the right to free speech on both sides of the coin. You can be for the alt-right and show up in Charlottesville and say we want to do this. And you can be a member of the anarchists or Antifa or follow those ideologies, and you have a right to do that. It's when it becomes violence that you have these issues. On the day of the rally in Charlottesville, when one of the alt-right supporters drove his car into that crowd, killing Heather Heyer and injuring numerous other people, that was taking it from First Amendment protests to an act of violence intended to coerce or intimidate a civilian population or the actions of a government. And that is when it becomes an act of domestic terrorism. Now, the driver of that car was charged with homicide. He was charged with numerous acts of assault on a number of people who were killed. He was charged with hate crime, but he was never charged with domestic terrorism. And I go back to why was he never charged with domestic terrorism? Because there is no penalty for the definition of domestic terrorism under sections 2331 of the U.S. Code. And in a strange twist, Richard Spencer came out this week saying that he is in support of Joe Biden. And so when I read that, I was like, wow, that's interesting.
What?
Yeah. But he said in a quote to his followers, so be patient. We'll have another day in the sun. We need to regroup and return in a new form. And you see this with these groups on the left and the right, where when the light of the sun is shown on their activities, they disband and they come back under a new name with the same platform.
I would imagine that neither candidate would want to have Richard Spencer endorse them.
I'll tell you his rationale. He has said that he is angry at the drone attack on the Iranian Soleimani, and that you really have to read into that in that Richard Spencer has been a strong supporter of Russia in his web postings, in his writings, in his rantings at colleges, a supporter of the Russian Putin and regime. So in killing Soleimani, that was also an attack on the connections between Russia and the support of Iran. So I could see where Richard Spencer would draw that. He's no longer a supporter of our current administration and is going with the opposition to that current administration. I mean, our squad motto, once again, I've said this in the past, I believe, on your webcast, is our squad motto was non fingus hoc excrementum. And we believe that is Latin for you can't make this shit up. And it is never truer than in these days that we're living. Now, as we go forward to a very troubling event, the October 27, 2018 Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, where 11 worshipers were killed by a gunman, Robert Bowers, and he arrived at the Tree of Life and just started shooting unarmed followers at the temple and killed 11 people, injured others. Our evidence team went up and assisted the Pittsburgh team. They did a phenomenal job. We were proud to be called to be able to go up there to assist their team in the crime scene review and collection. But this case quickly came home to Washington, D.C. when there were two brothers based out of Washington, D.C. One of the brothers, on the same day as the shooting in Pittsburgh, went out with a gun and magazines and ended up killing himself at Teddy Roosevelt Island in D.C. The two brothers were very big supporters of Robert Bowers online and were supporting him in his fear of white genocide. They held strong anti-Semitic views and were both against globalism. And if you go to the internet and you look up the photographs from the Charlottesville, the driver of the car that killed Heather Heyer is in a photograph, and in the background of that photograph is the two brothers who from Washington, D.C., who were also at that rally. And if you continue looking through the internet, you'll find a picture of those two brothers with Richard Spencer outside the White House for a photograph. So you'll see the connections that take place within this world, because these are the same people who are communicating online together. And I like to, the analogy is a little strange, but in the world of child pornography, if you're someone who is a child pornographer, in your darkest, deepest place, you have to know that this is wrong. But once you get online and you start chatting with people who also have the same issues and are talking about the same things, it makes you feel like maybe you're not wrong and that everyone else is wrong. And it's the same thing with domestic extremists. Once they get into this dark world of social media platforms where they're talking to people of like minds, they build on that. And then a small portion of those people will be the ones that say, I hear all this talk, but I have to be the one to go out and do something about it. Now, in the court hearings of the brother who lived, there were photographs that were released to the press of a flag inside of the house. And you mentioned Dylan Roof earlier, the shooter from the Black church. Mm-hmm. There's a flag photograph there that shows a very strange looking hairdo on a skull and crossbones. And that is Dylan Roof's hairstyle. And it's put onto that skull and crossbone as a way of supporting Dylan Roof in the killing of those black parishioners in South Carolina. So wow. The connections between these groups are strong. And the people who get to be the extreme of the extreme, and we'll talk about one of those groups that is the extreme of the extreme, is a group called Atomwaffen. And they're racially motivated violent extremists. They espouse the overthrow of the United States government. They want ethnic cleansing and a racial holy war. And they want to establish a white ethno-state. So they are also people who are accelerationists. They want to forward this. So the pandemic, the difficult economy, all these things they foresee as happening to forward the fall of civil society. And these guys can take over with their white ethno-state. And this just falls into their belief system. Interestingly, that the Atomwaffen, one of their idols is a guy named James Mason. He was a former American Nazi Party member with George Lincoln Rockwell, who I mentioned earlier, who split with William Pierce and started the National Alliance. Mason wrote a book called Siege, which is like the Bible of the Atomwaffen. And they were very big followers of the Turner Diary, which was written by William Pierce, who was the leader of the National Alliance based out of West Virginia. These guys, in the book Siege and in the book The Turner Diary, both of these guys have a young following within Atomwaffen, and they call for a new world order. They're anti-communists. They also throw in Satanists, and they've been involved in a number of homicides as individuals of this group itself. In the news recently, we are seeing what started as a meme-based online kind of chat room, not real world, the Boogaloo Boys, and they spell boys B-O-I-S. And you'll see these guys showing up. The first they showed up to was in Virginia, was a Second Amendment rally, and they perceive that the government is overstepping their bounds. They're extremely anti-police. They fear the red flag laws and that the restrictions for COVID, so these lockdowns with COVID, wear a mask, all this kind of stuff, that it's all part of a play to take guns from citizens. These guys, their base is libertarian or constitutionalist in strong support of the Second Amendment. They have both racially motivated ideologies through Adam Waffen and a group called the Base, and also because of their strong hatred of police officers, there have been instances where they've actually allied with Black Lives Matter protests because they hate police officers and they're against police officers on both sides of that coin. So it is a very strange enemy of my enemy is my friend type of a event. These guys started on a 4chan, which was a forum on the internet in 2019. And it spread from that social media platform to in person. And you'll see these guys showing up at these rallies heavily armed with Hawaiian shirts and like Pepe the Frog with a M4. Boogaloo is slang for a second civil war, the collapse of democracy. What they took from a 1984 movie sequel, Breaking 2 Electric Boogaloo, and built that into their online personas, and now have been involved in numerous events. In March of 2020, a guy named Duncan Socrates Lemp was shot in Maryland. The police department in Maryland was doing a raid on him for firearms. He engaged police officers, and now Lemp is a martyr for the Boogaloo cause. In March of 2020, a guy named Tim Wilson was killed in a shootout with FBI after they intervened in a plot that he had to attack a hospital where COVID-19 patients were being cared for. And probably most public is the April 2020 Aaron Swenson arrested. He was live streaming his hunt for police officers, and he was a follower of the Christchurch, New Zealand shooting where 53 people were killed by Brenton Tarrant. And Tarrant is a Boogaloo hero to them. In May, 3 Boogaloo boys were arrested for weapons and explosives violations. They were planning to incite violence at a Black Lives Matter rally. So you'll see this happening where just recently the Proud Boys, another right-wing extremist group, was involved in causing issues at some of these events. But probably
I've heard a lot about that, and of course, there's things on the internet saying that is a lie, or that there's no truth to that. So as far as law enforcement is concerned, they have proof these groups are infiltrating and causing, some of the rioting and looting. That's a question.
Yeah, so there has definitely been people from the right infiltrating groups on the left to try and increase the violence. And one perfect example of that is a very, very sad example. In May of 2020 and in June of 2020, a active duty Air Force Sergeant, Stephen Carrillo, killed an FPS officer at the Oakland courthouse. And his attempt there was to do this shooting of an officer at a post outside the courthouse in Oakland in an effort to get it to be blamed on Black Lives Matter protests that was taking place nearby. When the Santa Cruz Police Department went to arrest him, there was an officer that was killed during that arrest. So 2 police officers were killed by an active duty Air Force Boogaloo Boys member, and it started in an effort to throw blame of the killing of an FPS officer on the protest that was taking place nearby. So I don't think it gets any clearer that is part of the intent of this stuff. Now, I'm not here to tell you that the violence that's taking place outside of the First Amendment protected protests is all infiltrated members of right wing.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
People affiliated with movements on the left that are creating serious violations of the law. And if you look at each one of those, does that rise to the point of fulfilling that definition? So the definition of domestic terrorism is nonpartisan. It doesn't matter who you are. If you fill that definition and your criminal action is a serious criminal action. So what I've always said is if you have a left and a right standing at a rally and they're both holding signs and they're yelling at each other, and the guy from the right reaches over and hits the guy from the left on the head with a sign, that's not domestic terrorism, okay? That's an assault and battery. Charge them in a state court. But I just read in the news today where someone from one of these left-wing extremist movements, and this is, again, these are individuals on both the left and the right who are acting out. It's people taking it to the level of extremism and violence You need to take each one of these criminal actions and look at it through that definition and say, is this a serious, violent criminal action which is a violation of state or federal criminal codes? And if the answer is yes, then check that box. If the purpose of that violent criminal action was to cause fear, was it to intimidate either the civilian population or the government, then you check that second box. And then the third box, was it something that was designed and built here in the United States? If you check all three of those boxes, then you can say individually that action is a violation of domestic terrorism. Still, we have no ability to charge because there's no penalty under domestic terrorism. But you have to look at it individually, and that's what it should be, completely without politics, that you look at each one of these crimes that's taking place, serious crimes, and say that this is, I've had this conversation. If one of these boogaloo boys who hate police officers took a Molotov cocktail and threw it into a group of police officers, would we call that domestic terrorism? And I think many people would say, yeah. Now, if you took a Antifa movement follower and had them do the same thing, then you have some people who would say, well, it's just violence at a protest and this kind of stuff. I say both of them are potentially acts of domestic terrorism. You need to look at it. But the most important thing is it has to be a serious violation. It can't just be something that we are tagging people as being domestic terrorists for minor violations. It has to be serious. It has to be used very, very carefully.
Why?
Because I don't think we want to put a moniker of terrorism on somebody because today it's in the political realm that it's not good. It has to meet that same standard throughout our history, right? Back to that, I hit somebody with a sign on the other side and I split his head open. Well, that's serious, but it's not terrorism. That's just me hitting you in the head with a sign, or you hitting me in the head with a sign. That's a civil disobedience. That is a criminal action which should be arrested by the police and charged by the police. Now, if you show up in your car and you drive it into the opposition, well, then you thought about it, you plotted and you planned it, you did it for the purpose of causing mass destruction using your car. You want to influence those people and the government. So that starts to fit the definition of domestic terrorism. And we need to have a penalty applying to the definition of domestic terrorism. Definition of domestic terrorism is good as it is under 2331. There's just no way to charge anybody with it unless you use a bomb. Those are the current things. But I think there's also thrown into this mix, right, is you can't take away, like in the 90s, it was the economy, it was jobs, it was Second Amendment, it was perceived overreach by the federal government. Those kind of things are kind of going on today. But then you see where some of these groups may support the current government, unlike the militias of the old days that were all against the government. And it's just a very strange operation. And then you got to throw in these conspiracy theories, right? So I'll just quickly talk about two of them. One is the 5G technology, right? So there is a belief and a conspiracy theory. And because of the internet, the conspiracy theories have taken on their own life. And they've become reality to many people on the extremes. So the 5G technology, they believe that Bill Gates is responsible for the coronavirus and that the expansion of the 5G towers that he has talked about. He's also talked about getting viruses in general and finding cures for viruses through the World Health Organization. So the extremists with their conspiracy theories have come around to Bill Gates, coronavirus, 5G towers, that once we get a vaccine for the coronavirus, that's going to be used to implant a chip into the citizens of the United States, and they'll be tracked through the 5G towers.
Oh, my goodness.
Completely crazy to you and I. But if you talk about some of these conspiracy theories, people are believing them. And then one I'll end with is something that people are just now hearing about, and I just shake my head because it is really bizarre. It's the QAnon conspiracy theory. And I've had people that I respect say, well, there is this deep state. So the QAnon is a radical right-wing conspiracy growing online, started again on 4chan, which is one of these platforms that was built for the ability to be able to say pretty much anything you want in different chat rooms. So people talking to like-minded people and spinning each other up. They believe that there is a deep state and anti-Semitic pawnbrokers that are actively trying to unseat President Donald Trump. So the interesting thing about this movement is that it is taken off, right? You'll see people with, first when people started seeing it, they're like, what the heck is that? People at rallies and stuff with Q and all these things written on their hats and stuff. Q is supposed to be a high-ranking intelligence official within the United States government that's leaking anti-Donald Trump deep state information. So giving out little tidbits or dropping cues to people who are following the deep state. They believe that Hillary Clinton and Podesta and different people of that following are running a pedophile ring and trafficking in children. And this kind of came to a violent portion when in Washington, D.C., there was a shooting at a pizza shop. And
I remember this, yeah.
So that guy was a follower of Q, and he felt that in some of the emails that were released in the stolen emails from the Democratic Center, that they mentioned pizza. So that meant child sexual assaults, and that these children were kept in a basement at the Comet Pizza in D.C. So he drove literally almost across the country, live streaming back, saying that he was doing this to save the children. He went to that location, shot his way into the location, and found that there was no basement and that there were no children. And it goes to the point where these people will see the president wear a pink tie, and that's a signal that information is going to be coming out about the child predators. And, I mean, it is really bizarre, but there are people who follow this that you would just not think. And if you hear people either writing WWG, AWG1, one of their oaths through QAnon is, where we go one, we go all. And if you just Google that, you'll see some very prominent people who have filmed themselves taking an oath, and at the end of it, they say, where we go one, we go all. That's not something that you just come up with, right? There is a following of these QAnon people, which is in the thousands online, and they truly believe that these little pieces of information are being given out to them. And they believe that the election in 2020 is going to be stolen from President Trump. You see some of the stuff that's reporting online that there are people in the government that believe that the election is going to be stolen from President Trump. And that just builds into the QAnon conspiracy theory, deep state. And there have been criminal actions. One of the more bizarre ones, a QAnon follower killed a mob boss in New York City because he believed that they had been infiltrated and he needed to do this. So I've done this stuff for literally decades, and it has been an interesting career, but it is a time where the country is divided, and these conspiracy theories, these extremist ideologies and belief systems on both the left and the right have a firm footing, and those people in the middle are less and less. People have gone to their camps, and when you have more people going to the extreme and following ideologically, racially motivated movements, then you're going to have the potential for more people on the extreme of the extreme who are those lone offenders, who are the thing that law enforcement fears the most, taking action. I've been asked several times recently if I think that the election, which way it goes, is going to make a difference. And sadly, when it comes to domestic extremism, I don't think it's going to make a difference either way. If the Democrats win, then the extreme right, and I'm not talking, when I talk about the right and the left, when I talk about it, it is not Democrats and Republicans. It is the extreme. It's not CNN and Fox. It's the extreme. It's the 4chans, the chat rooms, and the people that are following these conspiracy theories. There's going to be violent reaction, and I hope I'm wrong, but I think my experience is telling me that there will be violent reaction to either side of this election, which is unfortunate.
I hope you're wrong too, but I have to ask you this question because you just retired in 2019. If something happens this fall, how are you going to react? You're no longer actively involved in the game. I take it it's going to be very similar to people who retired right before 9/11 and felt that they missed that opportunity.
I really did enjoy my career. I enjoyed the investigation side of it. I loved the crime scene processing portion of it. You really felt you were doing something for the families of the victims. The number of crime scenes, whether it be international, the embassy bombings, the USS Cole, the Pentagon, bombings around the world, domestically shootings at the Navy Yard, at the Virginia Beach, at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life, the number of shootings that I talked about in the case studies. I think the role that I'm able to play now as a private citizen in trying to get some information out to people who might not have the ability to get that information, using my experience working domestic terrorism, and I think it's important now. Whenever something happens, the flavor of the day, you're going to get a lot of people who quickly become experts in whatever that topic is, right? And that may be that they've read a couple books on it and now they can go talk about it. You're going to have a lot of people who are experts in domestic extremism and they just learned how to spell it. I've actually worked this stuff for over 2 decades and understand the domestic extremist mindset. I've talked to literally hundreds of them. I've had informants that have worked undercover in cases for and with me. And I think in my position as principal consultant for our small company and doing things like your podcast and doing webinars, when we get past this pandemic and we're able to get back into the conferences, I've spoken at literally hundreds of conferences related to domestic and international extremism. I think that knowledge is power. And, when you first hear about these things, it's scary as hell. And I think that the more people learn and be able to identify things and be able to assist their law enforcement and maybe stop something, in the position I'm in now and doing the research and training in these areas, I think it's a different chapter, but I still feel like I'm able to add something to that conversation.
So how would people get in contact with you?
Fed Squared Consulting, one word, @gmail.com. On LinkedIn, I'm under Tom O'Connor. I've been doing webinars with private companies and their population of employees. And also we've had some webinars where I've done for companies that open it up to the public. It's interesting and it is as timely as it possibly could be.
If you want to learn more, contact Tom. He's the subject matter expert and he's proved that today. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Chair, for having me. I really appreciate all you're doing to get the word out on the FBI and the good stories of agents.
During our last episode that we spoke, in episode 162, we did go through your origin story. So we're not going to do that again, but I do want to still give you the last word.
Right now, this country's at a very important time, and I'm not talking politics and elections. I'm talking about people going to their corners. We need to remember what this country felt like on 9/11, and hopefully we can bring together over a common goal, a pandemic, an economy, jobs, all these things. We need to come together and be there for each other.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Tom O'Connor and several articles and photos regarding the domestic terrorism threat today, and on white supremacy, Antifa, the Boogaloo Boys, and the Proud Boys. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.